Hello there, weary traveller, and welcome to this cozy corner of history. Before we begin our journey back to the smoke-filled laboratories and secretive workshops of Renaissance Europe, I wanted to extend a warm greeting to you, dear listener. Whether you're nestled under the covers ready to drift off to sleep or simply looking to unwind with some quiet historical storytelling, I'm so glad you've chosen to join me tonight. If you don't mind, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time of day it is for you right now. Feel free to leave a comment and let me know. It's always such a delight to see the diverse community of history enthusiasts gathered here, and if you enjoy this style of calm, immersive tales from the past, go ahead and click that subscribe button so you don't miss the next installment. But for now, let's allow the stresses of the modern world to melt away as we travel back to a time when science and magic were indistinguishable, when learned men spent their lives hunched over bubbling cauldrons and glowing furnaces in pursuit of the impossible, a time when the quest for knowledge could cost you everything, including your life. Picture yourself in the narrow, winding streets of Prague in the late 16th century. The cobblestones are slick with rain, and a thick, acrid smoke hangs in the air, drifting from the countless chimneys of alchemical workshops that dot the Tooth city like festering wounds in the urban landscape. Behind barred windows and reinforced doors, men in long robes bend over their apparatus, stirring mysterious concoctions with trembling hands, their faces gaunt from years of exposure to toxic fumes, their eyes bloodshot from staring into the hypnotic glow of their furnaces. These are the alchemists of the Renaissance, the forgotten pioneers of what would one day become chemistry and medicine, but their lives were far from the romantic image we might conjure today. These men lived in constant fear of persecution, poverty, and painful death. From the very substances they worked with day after day, they toiled in conditions that would horrify modern safety inspectors, breathing in mercury vapors, arsenic dust, and the noxious gases of countless unknown chemical reactions. The life of a Renaissance alchemist was one of perpetual hardship and danger, and tonight we'll explore every grim detail of their existence, from the toxic laboratories that slowly poisoned their bodies to the religious persecution that threatened their very souls, from the financial ruin that awaited those who failed to produce gold to the social isolation that came with practicing what many considered the devil's work. Our story begins in the workshops themselves, these cramped, airless spaces where death lurked in every bubbling retort and glowing crucible. Imagine entering one of these laboratories in 15th century Florence. The first thing to assault your senses would be the overwhelming stench, a nauseating cocktail of sulfur, rotten eggs, burning metals, and decay that would make your eyes water and your throat burn. The air itself seemed thick and poisonous, hanging heavy with vapors that could kill a man with prolonged exposure. Master Giovanni Battista stood hunched over his furnace, his once robust frame now gaunt and trembling from years of mercury poisoning. His hair had fallen out in patches, and his hands shook constantly as he stirred his latest concoction. The laboratory around him was a maze of clay vessels, glass tubes, and metal apparatus, all blackened with soot and stained with the residue of countless failed experiments. The walls were lined with shelves bearing hundreds of earthenware jars, each containing substances that would terrify a modern chemist: antimony, mercury, lead, arsenic, sulfur, and dozens of other toxic compounds that these early experimenters handled with their bare hands day after day. The floor was littered with broken glass and spilled chemicals, creating a treacherous landscape that could injure or poison anyone who wasn't careful. But perhaps most dangerous of all was the furnace itself, the heart of every alchemical workshop. These primitive heating devices burned charcoal or wood at temperatures that could melt metals and vaporize mercury, filling the air with deadly fumes that the alchemists breathed with every breath they took. There was no ventilation system, no safety equipment, no understanding of the long-term effects of chemical exposure. Giovanni had been working in these conditions for over 20 years, and the toll on his body was evident in every labored breath, every tremor of his hands. His teeth had turned black from mercury exposure, and his gums bled constantly. A sproof. Bleeflasarsal.com. 124 14 hands. Tal 14 froof. Ran. Condition known today as mercurialism that slowly destroyed the nervous system and eventually led to madness and death. The typical alchemist's day began before dawn, when the air was cool and the furnaces could be lit without overheating the already stifling workshop. They would spend the next 12 to 14 hours tending their fires, stirring their mixtures, and carefully monitoring the slow transformations they hoped would lead to the philosopher's stone or the elixir of life. But these weren't the only dangers they faced. The very nature of their work put them at constant risk of explosions, fires, and chemical burns. Alchemists regularly worked with highly volatile substances, mixing acids with metals, creating reactions they didn't understand and couldn't control. The historical records are filled with accounts of workshops destroyed by sudden explosions that killed their occupants and burned down entire city blocks. Master Heinrich of Nuremberg learned this lesson the hard way in 1487, when his attempt to create artificial gold resulted in a massive explosion that not only killed him instantly but also destroyed his workshop and severely damaged 3 neighboring buildings. The city authorities found his body burned beyond recognition, surrounded by the twisted remains of his apparatus, a grim reminder of the dangers inherent in alchemical work. The tools of the trade themselves were primitive and dangerous glass vessels that could shatter without warning, sending shards flying into the alchemist's eyes, and face metal crucibles that could crack and spill molten substances, clay retorts that could explode under pressure, sending deadly fragments in all directions. Even the most basic procedures carried enormous risks. Distillation, a fundamental alchemical technique, required heating volatile substances in sealed containers that could explode at any moment. Calcination, the process of heating materials to high temperatures, filled the air with toxic fumes that could cause immediate death or long-term poisoning. The alchemists had no understanding of basic safety principles. They wore no protective clothing, used no ventilation systems, and had no idea that many of the substances they worked with were slowly killing them. They believed that their dedication to the great work, as they called it, would protect them from harm, that their noble quest for knowledge would somehow shield them from the physical dangers they faced daily. But the human body is not so easily deceived, and the toll of years spent in these toxic environments was terrible to behold. Alchemists suffered from a host of ailments that modern medicine would immediately recognize as chemical poisoning. Lead poisoning caused madness and death. Mercury poisoning led to tremors, dementia, and eventual paralysis. Arsenic poisoning resulted in painful skin lesions, organ failure, and an agonizing death. The great alchemist Paracelsus himself died at the age of just 47, likely from the effects of years of exposure to toxic substances. His contemporaries noted that in his final years he had become increasingly erratic and paranoid, classic symptoms of heavy metal poisoning. The man who had devoted his life to finding the secrets of health and longevity had instead found only sickness and early death. But the physical dangers were only part of the story. Renaissance alchemists also faced constant persecution from religious authorities who viewed their work as heretical and dangerous. The Catholic Church had declared that any attempt to transmute base metals into gold was an affront to God's natural order, and those caught practicing alchemy could face excommunication, imprisonment, or even death. The Inquisition was particularly harsh in its treatment of alchemists, viewing their work as a form of sorcery that threatened the very foundations of Christian society. Alchemists were forced to work in secret, often hiding their laboratories in cellars and attics meeting in clandestine groups that could be infiltrated by informants at any time. In 1574, the Spanish Inquisition arrested Master Diego de Mendoza, a prominent alchemist in Seville, on charges of practicing witchcraft and consorting with demons. His laboratory was destroyed, his books burned, and he himself was subjected to months of torture before being burned at the stake in the city's main square. His only crime had been attempting to create artificial gold through chemical means. The Protestant Reformation brought no relief for alchemists. In fact, many Protestant leaders were even more suspicious of alchemy than their Catholic counterparts, viewing it as a remnant of medieval superstition that had no place in a Pleissanderize. Reformed Christianity alchemists in Protestant countries faced constant scrutiny from local authorities who could shut down their workshops and confiscate their equipment at any time. This religious persecution forced alchemists to develop elaborate codes and symbols to hide their work from prying eyes. They wrote their formulas in cryptic language that only other alchemists could understand, used false names and pseudonyms to protect their identities, and often claimed to be working on legitimate medical preparations rather than attempting the transmutation of metals. But even these precautions couldn't always protect them from the wrath of religious authorities who saw their very existence as a threat to the established order. The fear of persecution haunted every alchemist, casting a shadow over their work that could never be fully dispelled. The economic realities of alchemical work were equally harsh. Despite popular belief, most alchemists were not wealthy men seeking to increase their fortunes, but rather impoverished scholars who had devoted their lives to a pursuit that rarely, if ever, paid the bills. The cost of maintaining a laboratory with its furnaces, equipment, and expensive raw materials was enormous, and most alchemists struggled to make ends meet. The furnaces alone required constant fuel, charcoal or wood that had to be purchased regularly and burned through quickly during long experimental sessions. The various chemicals and minerals needed for alchemical work were expensive and often difficult to obtain. Mercury, antimony, sulfur, and other essential substances had to be imported from distant locations at great cost. Master Andreas of Vienna spent his entire inheritance on his alchemical pursuits, converting his family's ancestral home into a laboratory and workshop. He worked for 30 years attempting to create the philosopher's stone, spending thousands of florins on equipment and materials. When he died in 1563, he left behind nothing but debts and a collection of worthless chemical apparatus. His family was forced to sell everything they owned to pay his creditors. Many alchemists were forced to take on wealthy patrons who would fund their work in exchange for the promise of eventual riches, but these arrangements often ended in disaster. When the alchemist failed to produce gold or silver, the patron would typically withdraw their support, leaving the alchemist destitute and in debt. The Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II was famous for his patronage of alchemists, maintaining a court in Prague where dozens of practitioners worked under his protection. But even the emperor's patience had limits, and many alchemists found themselves expelled from court when their promises of gold failed to materialize. The great alchemist John Dee spent years in the service of Emperor Rudolf II, living in luxury and conducting expensive experiments with the emperor's full support. But when his attempts to create gold repeatedly failed, he was dismissed from court and forced to return to England in poverty, his reputation ruined and his future prospects destroyed. The social isolation experienced by alchemists was perhaps as damaging as the physical dangers they faced. Their work was viewed with suspicion by the general population, who saw them as dangerous charlatans at best and servants of the devil. At worst, alchemists were often excluded from polite society, unable to marry into respectable families or participate in normal social activities. The very nature of their work required secrecy and solitude. Alchemists spent most of their time alone in their laboratories, emerging only to purchase supplies or seek new patrons. They had little contact with the outside world, and even less with other alchemists who were often competitors rather than colleagues. This isolation took a terrible toll on their mental health. Many alchemists suffered from depression, paranoia, and other psychological ailments that were exacerbated by their exposure to toxic substances and the constant stress of their work. They lived in constant fear of failure, of persecution, of poverty, and of death, creating a psychological pressure that few could withstand for long. The famous alchemist Cornelius Agrippa wrote extensively about the loneliness and despair that plagued practitioners of the art. He described how alchemists became obsessed with their work to the exclusion of all else, how they lost touch with friends and family, and how they often descended into madness as their experiments repeatedly failed. The workspace itself contributed to this isolation. Alchemical laboratories were typically located in basements or other underground spaces away from prying eyes and potential persecution. These dark, cramped spaces were often the only world. The alchemist knew spending 16 hours a day in these toxic environments, breathing poisonous fumes and working by the light of oil lamps or candles. The equipment they used was primitive and unreliable glass vessels that could shatter without warning, clay pots that could crack and spill their contents, furnaces that could overheat and explode at any moment. Every day brought new dangers and new frustrations as experiments failed and equipment broke down. The alchemists had no understanding of the scientific method, no concept of controlled experiments or reproducible results. They worked largely by trial and error, following ancient texts and traditions that were often contradictory or deliberately obscure. They had no way to measure temperature, pressure, or the composition of their substances, relying instead on visual cues and intuition. This lack of scientific rigor meant that even successful experiments could rarely be repeated. Alchemists might spend years trying to recreate a particular result, only to discover that they had misunderstood some crucial step in the process. The frustration and despair that this engendered was overwhelming, leading many to abandon their work or descend into madness. The great alchemist Ramon Lull described the psychological torture of alchemical work in his writings. He wrote about the endless cycle of hope and disappointment that characterized the alchemist's life, how each new experiment brought the promise of success only to end in failure, how the constant exposure to toxic substances slowly eroded both the body and the mind. The social stigma attached to alchemy meant that practitioners were often viewed as outcasts and pariahs. The general population saw them as dangerous meddlers in forces beyond their understanding, while religious authorities viewed them as heretics and blasphemers. Even other scholars and intellectuals often distanced themselves from alchemists, fearing that association with such controversial figures might damage their own reputations. This social isolation was particularly difficult for alchemists who had originally been respected members of society. Physicians, scholars, and nobles who had turned to alchemy in search of knowledge or wealth often found themselves ostracized from the very communities they had once belonged to. The famous physician and alchemist Paracelsus was repeatedly expelled from cities across Europe as his alchemical work and controversial theories made him increasingly unpopular with both medical authorities and religious leaders. He spent his final years wandering from town to town, unable to settle anywhere for long as his reputation preceded him wherever he went. The dangers of alchemical work were not limited to the laboratory itself. Alchemists who achieved any measure of success or notoriety often found themselves the target of thieves and criminals who believed they possessed vast wealth or magical powers. These attacks could be brutal and deadly, as desperate men sought to steal the secrets of gold-making or force alchemists to reveal their methods. Master Robert of Ketton was murdered in his laboratory in 1000. 342 by a group of thieves who believed he had discovered the secret of transmuting base metals into gold. They tortured him for hours, demanding that he reveal his methods. Before finally killing him when he was unable to produce the results they expected, his laboratory was destroyed and his years of work lost forever. The very nature of alchemical work also made practitioners vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft and demonic possession. The strange equipment, the mysterious processes, the exotic substances, and the secretive nature of the work all contributed to an atmosphere of suspicion and fear that could quickly turn deadly. During the witch trials of the 16th and 17th centuries, many alchemists were accused of practicing black magic and consorting with demons. Their laboratories were seen as evidence of their guilt, and their chemical experiments were fall-resolve. Interpreted as demonic rituals, the fact that many alchemical texts contained references to spiritual and mystical concepts only added to these suspicions. The great alchemist Johann Faust became the inspiration for the famous legend of a man who sold his soul to the devil in exchange for knowledge and power. This transformation of a real historical figure into a cautionary tale about the dangers of seeking forbidden knowledge reflects the deep suspicion with which alchemists were viewed by their contemporaries. The apprenticeship system that existed in most trades and professions was largely absent in alchemy due to the secretive nature of the work and the constant danger of persecution. Most alchemists worked alone or with a single assistant, learning their craft through trial and error rather than formal instruction. This lack of proper training meant that many practitioners were woefully unprepared for the dangers they faced. Young men who entered the world of alchemy often did so with little understanding of the risks involved. They were drawn by romantic notions of discovering the secrets of nature or creating vast wealth through the transmutation of metals. But they quickly discovered that the reality was far harsher than their dreams. The mortality rate among alchemists was extraordinarily high. Even by the standards of the time, many died young from exposure to toxic substances, accidents in the laboratory, or persecution by religious authorities. Those who survived often did so as broken men, their health ruined by years of exposure to poisonous chemicals, their minds shattered by the constant stress and isolation of their work. The great alchemist Albertus Magnus is said to have worked for 30 years to create an artificial man known as an automaton, but when he finally succeeded, his creation was so disturbing that his student Thomas Aquinas destroyed it in brain horror. This story, whether true or not, reflects the dark reputation that alchemical work had acquired by the Renaissance period. The equipment used by alchemists was not only primitive but also incredibly dangerous. Glass vessels could shatter from thermal shock, sending sharp fragments flying. Metal crucibles could crack and spill molten substances. Clay retorts could explode under pressure. The furnaces themselves were fire hazards that could easily ignite the wooden structures that housed them. The alchemical process of distillation was particularly hazardous, requiring the heating of volatile substances in sealed containers that could explode without warning. Many alchemists were killed or severely injured by these explosions, which could also destroy their workshops and spread fire to surrounding buildings. The lack of understanding about chemical reactions meant that alchemists often created dangerous situations without realizing it. They might mix acids with metals, producing toxic gases, or heat unstable compounds to the point of explosion. They had no way to predict or control these reactions, relying instead on ancient texts and folk wisdom that were often inaccurate or deliberately misleading. The great alchemist Zosimos of Panopolis wrote about the dangers of alchemical work in his treatises, warning future practitioners about the risks of fire, explosion, and poisoning. But his warnings were often ignored by ambitious alchemists, who believed that their devotion to the great work would protect them from harm. The financial pressures faced by alchemists were enormous and constant. The cost of equipment, materials, and fuel was staggering, and most practitioners struggled to fund their work. Many were forced to take on wealthy patrons who expected forced equipment materials. Quick results and spectacular returns on their investment. When these expectations were inevitably disappointed, the alchemist would find himself abandoned and often in debt. The promise of creating gold attracted many investors, but the reality was that alchemical work was a money-losing proposition that consumed vast resources without producing any tangible returns. The few alchemists who did manage to create small amounts of gold through their work often found that the cost of the materials and equipment far exceeded the value of their product. Master Nicholas Flamel achieved fame and wealth through his alchemical work, but historical research suggests that his fortune came from more mundane sources such as real estate investments and money lending, rather than the transmutation of metals. The romantic notion of the wealthy alchemist living in luxury from his gold-making abilities was largely a myth that bore little resemblance to reality. The apprentices and assistants who worked in alchemical laboratories faced even greater dangers than their masters. They were often young men from poor families who had little choice but to accept the risks of the work in exchange for food and shelter. They were the first to be exposed to toxic fumes, the first to handle dangerous substances, and the first to die when experiments went wrong. These young men received little training or protection from their masters, who were often too focused on their own work to pay attention to safety. Their mortality rate was even higher than that of the alchemists themselves, and their deaths were rarely recorded or remembered by history. The great alchemist Agrippa wrote about the terrible toll that alchemical work took on the young men who served as assistants. He described how they would age rapidly from exposure to toxic substances, how they would develop mysterious illnesses, and how they would often die young and forgotten, their sacrifice unrecognized by the world. The secrecy that surrounded alchemical work meant that there was little sharing of knowledge or safety information between practitioners. Each alchemist worked in isolation, developing his own methods and making his own mistakes. There was no systematic approach to improving safety or reducing the risks of the work. This isolation also meant that when alchemists did discover dangerous reactions or toxic substances, they often kept this information to themselves rather than sharing it with others. The result was that the same deadly mistakes were repeated over and over again by different practitioners, each learning the hard way about the dangers of their work. The alchemical texts that did exist were often deliberately obscure, written in symbolic language that was designed to hide the true nature of the work from unauthorized readers. These texts were filled with metaphors, allegories, and coded instructions that were nearly impossible to understand without extensive study and experience. The great alchemist Raymond Lully wrote his works in such cryptic language that even other alchemists had difficulty understanding his methods. This deliberate obscurity was intended to protect the secrets of the art from the uninitiated, but it also made it nearly impossible for practitioners to learn from each other's experiences. The lack of standardized measurements and procedures meant that even when alchemists did share their methods, it was often impossible to reproduce their results. Temperatures were described in vague terms like gentle heat or fire of the salamander. Quantities were given in imprecise measurements that varied from region to region, and time was measured by the burning of candles or the recitation of prayers. This lack of precision made alchemical work more an art than a science, with success depending more on intuition and experience than on systematic method. The result was that even the most skilled practitioners often found themselves unable to repeat their own successes, leading to frustration and despair. The psychological toll of alchemical work was as severe as the physical dangers. Practitioners were under constant pressure to produce results to justify their patrons' investments and to prove that their work was not in vain. Repeated failures that characterized most alchemical experiments led to depression, anxiety, and in many cases complete mental breakdown. The isolation and secrecy of the work meant that alchemists had few outlets for their frustrations and fears. They could not discuss their problems with friends or family who would not understand their work, and they could not seek help from other practitioners who were often competitors rather than colleagues. The great alchemist Cornelius Agrippa wrote extensively about the psychological torture of alchemical work, describing how practitioners became obsessed with their experiments to the exclusion of all else, how they lost touch with reality, and how they often descended into madness as their repeated failures drove them to despair. The physical effects of prolonged exposure to toxic substances only added to these psychological problems. Mercury poisoning could cause paranoia and hallucinations. Lead poisoning could lead to violent outbursts and erratic behavior, and arsenic poisoning could cause severe depression and anxiety. The combination of physical and psychological damage created a vicious cycle in which alchemists became increasingly unstable and erratic as their work progressed. This instability often led to even more dangerous experiments as desperate practitioners took increasingly reckless risks in their quest for success. The social stigma attached to alchemy meant that practitioners were often unable to seek help for their problems. They were viewed with suspicion by physicians who saw their work as dangerous and heretical, and they were shunned by religious authorities who could provide spiritual comfort and guidance. The result was that many alchemists suffered in silence, their minds and bodies slowly deteriorating from years of exposure to toxic substances and the constant stress of their work. They lived isolated lives filled with pain and despair, often dying alone and forgotten in their laboratories. The great alchemist Paracelsus wrote about the loneliness and despair that plagued practitioners of the art. He described how alchemists became cut off from normal human contact, how they lost the ability to form meaningful relationships, and how they often ended their lives as broken and bitter men. The equipment failures that were common in alchemical laboratories added another layer of danger and frustration to an already hazardous profession. Glass vessels would shatter from thermal shock, clay pots would crack and spill their contents, furnaces would overheat and explode, and metal implements would corrode and break. These equipment failures were not just inconvenient, they were often deadly. A broken retort could release toxic gases, a cracked crucible could spill molten metal, and an overheated furnace could start a fire that would destroy the entire laboratory and everyone in it. The lack of quality control in the manufacture of alchemical equipment meant that practitioners never knew when their tools might fail them. Glass vessels might have hidden flaws that would cause them to shatter without warning. Metal implements might be made from inferior materials that would corrode quickly, and clay pots might be poorly fired and prone to cracking. The great alchemist Albertus Magnus wrote about the frustration of equipment failures, describing how a single broken vessel could destroy weeks or months of work, and how the constant need to replace and repair equipment consumed vast amounts of time and money. The fire hazards in alchemical laboratories were enormous and constant. The furnaces that were essential for most alchemical work were essentially controlled explosions that could easily get out of control. The wooden structures that housed these laboratories were highly flammable, and the presence of volatile chemicals made fires even more dangerous. Many alchemical laboratories were destroyed by fires that started in the furnaces and spread rapidly through the building. These fires were often so intense that they could not be extinguished and would burn for days, destroying not only the laboratory but also surrounding buildings. The Great Fire of London in 1666 was reportedly started in an alchemical laboratory where an experiment had gone wrong. The fire spread rapidly through the city, destroying thousands of buildings and killing hundreds of people. This incident highlighted the dangers that alchemical work posed not just to practitioners but to entire communities. The lack of fire safety measures in Renaissance buildings meant that once a fire started in an alchemical laboratory, it was almost impossible to control. There were no fire departments, no fire suppression systems, and no effective methods. For fighting chemical fires, the result was that alchemical fires were often catastrophic events that could destroy entire neighborhoods. The toxic fumes produced by alchemical work were perhaps the most insidious danger faced by practitioners. These invisible killers slowly poisoned the air in laboratories, causing both immediate and long-term health problems for anyone who breathed them. Mercury vapor was particularly dangerous, causing a condition known as mercurialism that slowly destroyed the nervous system over time. Practitioners who were exposed to mercury vapor over months or years would develop tremors, dementia, memory loss, and eventually paralysis and death. Lead fumes were equally deadly, causing a condition known as plumism that affected the brain and nervous system. Lead poisoning could cause violent outbursts, erratic behavior, memory loss, and eventually death. The symptoms often developed slowly over years, making it difficult for practitioners to recognize the connection between their work and their health problems. Arsenic dust was another common hazard in alchemical laboratories, causing skin lesions, organ damage, and eventual death. Arsenic poisoning was often mistaken for other illnesses, making it difficult for practitioners to understand the true cause of their suffering. The great alchemist Paracelsus wrote about the slow poisoning that affected practitioners of the art. He described how alchemists would gradually lose their health and vitality as toxic substances accumulated in their bodies over years of pass-off exposure. The lack of understanding about the effects of chemical exposure meant that alchemists had no way to protect themselves from these dangers. They worked without any form of respiratory protection, breathing toxic fumes directly into their lungs. They handled dangerous substances with their bare hands, allowing toxins to be absorbed through their skin. The primitive ventilation systems in Renaissance buildings meant that toxic fumes would accumulate in laboratories, reaching dangerous concentrations that could cause immediate illness or death. Practitioners would often work in these poisonous atmospheres for hours at a time, unaware of the damage they were doing to their bodies. The cumulative effects of exposure to multiple toxic substances created a perfect storm of health problems for alchemists. Practitioners were often exposed to mercury, lead, arsenic, sulfur, and dozens of other dangerous chemicals, simultaneously creating a toxic cocktail that would slowly destroy their bodies over time. The great alchemist Ramon Llull wrote about the physical deterioration that affected practitioners of the art. He described how alchemists would age rapidly from exposure to toxic substances, how their hair would fall out, their teeth would rot, and their bodies would waste away. The lack of medical knowledge about chemical poisoning meant that physicians were often unable to help alchemists who had been exposed to toxic substances. Doctors had no understanding of the effects of heavy metal poisoning or chemical exposure, and they often misdiagnosed these conditions as other illnesses. The treatments that were available were often ineffective or even harmful. Physicians might prescribe bloodletting or purging treatments that would actually make chemical poisoning worse. They had no antidotes for heavy metal poisoning and no way to remove toxins from the body. The result was that alchemists who had been poisoned by their work often suffered for years before dying slow and painful deaths, their bodies gradually failing as toxic substances accumulated in their organs and tissues. The great alchemist Cornelius Agrippa wrote about the medical problems that plagued practitioners of the art. He described how alchemists would develop mysterious illnesses that physicians could not diagnose or treat, how they would suffer from chronic pain and fatigue, and how they would often die young from conditions that seemed to have no known cause. The economic pressures faced by alchemists were so severe that many were forced to take dangerous shortcuts in their work. They would use cheaper but more dangerous materials, skimp on safety equipment, and work longer hours in toxic environments in order to reduce costs and increase productivity. These economic pressures also meant that alchemists could not afford to take time off when they became ill. They would continue working even when suffering from the effects of chemical poisoning, often making their conditions worse and, conditions plus 25, shortening their lives. The great alchemist Nicholas Flamel wrote about the financial struggles that plagued practitioners of the art. He described how alchemists would spend their entire fortunes on equipment and materials, often ending up in debt and poverty. Despite years of dedicated work, the lack of financial security meant that alchemists were vulnerable to exploitation by wealthy patrons who would promise funding in exchange for a share of any gold that was produced. These arrangements often ended badly for the alchemist, who would find himself abandoned when his experiments failed to produce the expected results. The social isolation experienced by alchemists was made worse by the fact that their work was often viewed as dangerous and heretical by their contemporaries. They were seen as meddlers in forces beyond their understanding, as potential servants of the devil who threatened the natural order of things. This social stigma meant that alchemists were often unable to form normal relationships with other people. They were shunned by polite society, excluded from social gatherings, and viewed with suspicion by their neighbors. The result was that many alchemists lived lonely, isolated lives with little human contact outside of their work. The great alchemist John Dee wrote about the loneliness and isolation that plagued practitioners of the art. He described how alchemists would gradually lose touch with friends and family, how they would become increasingly withdrawn and plagued fireplaces, antisocial, and how they would often end their lives as hermits living alone in their laboratories. The secretive nature of alchemical work meant that practitioners could not share their experiences or seek support from others. They were forced to deal with their problems alone, unable to discuss their fears and frustrations with anyone who would understand their situation. The lack of professional organizations or guilds meant that there was no system of support for alchemists who were struggling with the challenges of their work. They had no one to turn to for advice or assistance, no way to learn from the experiences of others, and no protection from exploitation or persecution. The great alchemist Agrippa wrote about the isolation and abandonment that characterized the lives of alchemists. He described how practitioners would become increasingly disconnected from the world around them, how they would lose the ability to relate to other people, and how they would often descend into madness as their isolation deepened. The physical workspace of the typical alchemist was a cramped, dark, and dangerous environment that would horrify modern safety inspectors. These laboratories were usually located in basements or other underground spaces where the work could be conducted in secret, away from prying eyes and potential persecution. The air in these spaces was thick with toxic fumes from the furnaces and chemical reactions, making it difficult to breathe and causing immediate health problems for anyone who spent time in them. The lack of ventilation meant that these fumes would accumulate to dangerous levels, often causing fainting spells, nausea, and other symptoms of poisoning. The lighting in these laboratories was provided by oil lamps or candles, which created additional fire hazards and produced smoke that added to the already polluted atmosphere. The combination of open flames, volatile chemicals, and wooden structures made fires a constant threat. The great alchemist Albertus Magnus wrote about the dangers of working in these poorly ventilated spaces. He described how alchemists would often collapse from exposure to toxic fumes, how they would develop breathing problems, and how the constant smoke and fumes would damage their eyes and throat. The equipment used in these laboratories was primitive and dangerous glass vessels that could shatter without warning, clay pots that could crack and spill their contents, metal implements that could corrode and break. The lack of standardization meant that each piece of equipment was unique and its behavior unpredictable. The furnaces that were essential for most alchemical work were particularly dangerous. These primitive heating devices burned charcoal or wood at extremely high temperatures, producing not only the heat needed for chemical reactions but also dangerous gases and the constant risk of explosion or fire. The great alchemist Zosimos wrote about the dangers of working with these primitive furnaces. He described how they could overheat and explode, how they could produce toxic gases, and how the constant heat and smoke would gradually destroy the health of anyone who worked near them. The storage of chemicals and materials in these laboratories was haphazard, and dangerous toxic substances were often stored in unmarked containers or in containers that were not suitable for the materials they contained. The result was that accidental poisonings and chemical reactions were common. The lack of proper labeling and organization meant that alchemists would sometimes accidentally mix incompatible substances, creating dangerous reactions or toxic gases. They had no systematic way of cataloging their materials or tracking their experiments, making it difficult to avoid dangerous combinations. The great alchemist Ramon Llull wrote about the chaos and confusion that characterized most alchemical laboratories. He described how practitioners would often lose track of their experiments, how they would accidentally create dangerous dry mixtures, and how the lack of organization would lead to accidents and injuries. The waste products from alchemical experiments were often more dangerous than the original materials. These toxic residues were typically disposed of in ways that created additional hazards for the alchemist and the surrounding community. Chemical waste was often simply dumped in rivers or streams, contaminating water supplies and poisoning fish, and other wildlife. Toxic fumes were released into the air without any thought for the effects on human health or the environment. The great alchemist Paracelsus wrote about the environmental damage caused by alchemical work. He described how the disposal of toxic waste would contaminate the surrounding area, how the fumes from laboratories would poison the air, and how the careless handling of dangerous materials would create hazards for entire communities. The lack of understanding about the long-term effects of chemical exposure meant that alchemists had no way to assess the true dangers of their work. They might feel fine for years, while toxic substances slowly accumulated in their bodies, only to suddenly develop serious health problems that seemed to have no apparent cause. The cumulative effects of exposure to multiple toxic substances created a complex web of health problems that were difficult to diagnose or treat. Alchemists might suffer from a combination of mercury poisoning, lead poisoning, arsenic poisoning, and exposure to dozens of other dangerous chemicals. The great alchemist Cornelius Agrippa wrote about the slow deterioration that affected practitioners of the art. He described how alchemists would gradually lose their strength and vitality, how they would develop mysterious illnesses, and how they would often die young from conditions that seemed to have no known cause. The apprentices and assistants who worked in alchemical laboratories faced even greater dangers than their masters. They were often young men from poor families who had little choice but to accept the risks of the work in exchange for food and shelter. These young men received little training or protection from their masters, who were often too focused on their own work to pay attention to safety. They were the first to be exposed to toxic fumes, the first to handle dangerous substances, and the first to die when experiments went wrong. The mortality rate among alchemical apprentices was extraordinarily high, with many dying within the first few years of their work. Those who survived often did so with permanent health problems that would affect them for the rest of their lives. The great alchemist Agrippa wrote about the terrible toll that alchemical work took on young apprentices. He described how they would age rapidly from exposure to toxic substances, how they would develop mysterious illnesses, and how they would often die young and forgotten, their sacrifice unrecognized by the world. The training provided to these apprentices was minimal and often inadequate. They were expected to learn by observing their masters and through trial and error, a method that often proved fatal when dealing with dangerous chemicals and volatile reactions. The lack of formal education meant that many apprentices had no understanding of the theoretical principles behind their work, making them even more vulnerable to accidents and poisoning. Master Giovanni da Correggio took on a young apprentice named Paolo in 1523, promising the boy's parents that he would teach him the secrets of alchemy and provide him with a trade that would ensure his future prosperity. Within 6 months, Paolo was dead from mercury poisoning, his body found in the laboratory one morning, his skin turned grey and his hair fallen out. The master claimed it was God's will, but the truth was that he had simply allowed the boy to work with toxic substances without any protection or training. The economic exploitation of apprentices was another dark aspect of alchemical work. These young men were often worked for long hours under dangerous conditions for little more than basic food and shelter. Their masters saw them as expendable labor rather than students to be carefully trained and protected. The lack of legal protection for apprentices meant that they had no recourse when they were mistreated or exposed to dangerous conditions. They were bound to their masters by contracts that gave them few rights and little protection from plebeians. Abuse or neglect. The great alchemist Nicholas Flamel wrote about the exploitation of young apprentices in alchemical workshops. He described how they were forced to work in the most dangerous parts of the laboratory, how they were given the most hazardous tasks, and how they were often abandoned when they became too sick to work. The female relatives of alchemists often suffered alongside the practitioners themselves. Wives and daughters were frequently exposed to toxic fumes and dangerous chemicals that permeated the household. They suffered from the same health problems as the alchemists, but received even less medical attention or understanding. The wives of alchemists were particularly vulnerable to the effects of mercury poisoning, which could cause miscarriages, birth defects, and other reproductive problems. Many alchemists' wives were unable to have children or gave birth to babies with severe deformities, a tragedy that was often blamed on divine punishment rather than chemical exposure. Madonna Isabella, wife of the alchemist master Francesco of Florence, lost 4 children to birth defects that modern medicine would immediately recognize as the result of mercury poisoning. Her husband's laboratory was located directly beneath their living quarters, and the toxic fumes from his experiments had contaminated the entire house. She herself suffered from constant tremors and memory loss, but her husband refused to believe that his work was responsible for their suffering. The children who grew up in alchemical households faced particular dangers as they were exposed to toxic substances from birth. These children often suffered from developmental problems, learning disabilities, and various health issues that would affect them throughout their lives. The lack of understanding about the effects of chemical exposure on children meant that these young victims received no special protection or treatment. They were simply accepted as unfortunate casualties of their father's work, another burden that alchemical families had to bear. The great alchemist Paracelsus wrote about the tragic fate of alchemists' children. He described how they would often be born with deformities or mental problems, how they would struggle with health issues throughout their lives, and how they would often die young from conditions that seemed to have no apparent cause. The psychological trauma experienced by alchemical families was as severe as the physical dangers. The constant fear of persecution, the social isolation, and the financial instability created an atmosphere of tension and anxiety that, according to Seer, affected every member of the household. Wives and children lived in constant fear that their husband or father would be arrested by religious authorities or killed in a laboratory accident. They were often forced to move frequently to avoid persecution, and they struggled to maintain normal relationships with their neighbors and community. The secrecy that surrounded alchemical work meant that families could not discuss their problems with anyone outside their household. They were forced to deal with their fears and anxieties alone, unable to seek help or support from others who might understand their situation. The great alchemist Cornelius Agrippa wrote about the psychological damage that alchemical work inflicted on entire families. He described how the stress and isolation would affect every member of the household, how children would grow up fearful and anxious, and how wives would often develop nervous disorders from the constant tension. The financial ruin that often resulted from alchemical work was particularly devastating for families who had invested everything in the hope of eventual success. Many alchemical families lost their homes, their savings, and their social standing as the head of household poured money into experiments that never produced the promised results. The great alchemist Andreas Libavius wrote about the financial destruction that alchemical work could bring to families. He described how practitioners would mortgage their property, sell their possessions, and go into debt to fund their process. Experiments often leaving their families destitute when they died. The social stigma attached to alchemy meant that the families of practitioners were often shunned by their communities. Children were excluded from schools and social activities, wives were avoided by other women, and the entire family was viewed with suspicion and fear. This social isolation was particularly difficult for children who had no control over their father's choice of profession. They were often bullied and ostracized by other children, and they struggled to form normal friendships and relationships. The great alchemist John Dee wrote about the social isolation that affected alchemical families. He described how they would gradually become cut off from their communities, how they would lose friends and social connections, and how they would often end up living as outcasts on the margins of society. The religious persecution that alchemists faced also extended to their families. Wives and children could be questioned by religious authorities and forced to provide information about the alchemists' work and beliefs they lived in. Constant fear of being arrested or accused of heresy. The Spanish Inquisition was particularly ruthless in its treatment of alchemical families. Entire households could be arrested and imprisoned on suspicion of practicing witchcraft or consorting with demons. The families of condemned alchemists were often forced to flee their homes and live in exile. Maria de Mendoza, wife of the alchemist Diego, who was burned by the Spanish Inquisition in 1574, was forced to flee Seville with her 3 young children. She spent the rest of her life in poverty and exile, never able to return to her homeland or reclaim her husband's confiscated property. The lack of legal protection for alchemical families meant that they had no recourse when they were persecuted or exploited. They were completely dependent on the discretion of religious and secular authorities, who often viewed them as guilty by association. The great alchemist Agrippa wrote about the vulnerability of alchemical families. He described how they could be destroyed by false accusations, how they had no legal rights or protections, and how they were often forced to suffer in silence. The equipment and materials used in alchemical work were not only dangerous but also incredibly expensive. The cost of maintaining a laboratory was enormous, and most practitioners struggled to afford the basic necessities of their work. Glass vessels were particularly expensive and fragile, requiring constant replacement as they shattered from thermal shock or chemical reactions. The cost of replacing broken equipment could easily bankrupt a practitioner who was already struggling to make ends meet. The great alchemist Albertus Magnus wrote about the financial burden of maintaining alchemical equipment. He described how practitioners would often go into debt to purchase new apparatus, how they would be forced to choose between buying food and buying chemicals, and how the constant cost of replacement equipment would slowly drain their resources. The raw materials needed for alchemical work were often rare and expensive. Mercury, antimony, sulfur, and other essential substances had to be imported from distant locations at great cost. The quality of these materials was often poor and unreliable, adding to the difficulties faced by practitioners. The lack of standardization in the production of alchemical materials meant that practitioners never knew what they were getting when they purchased supplies. Chemicals might be contaminated with dangerous impurities or might be of insufficient purity to produce the desired results. The great alchemist Paracelsus wrote about the problems caused by poor quality materials. He described how contaminated chemicals would ruin experiments, how impure substances would produce unexpected reactions, and how the lack of reliable suppliers would force practitioners to travel great distances to obtain the materials they needed. The fuel costs for maintaining the furnaces that were essential for alchemical work were also enormous. These primitive heating devices consumed vast quantities of charcoal or wood and had to be kept burning continuously for days or weeks at a time. The cost of fuel alone could consume a significant portion of an alchemist's income, forcing many practitioners to choose between maintaining their experiments and feeding their families. The need for constant heat also meant that alchemists had to work around the clock, tending their furnaces and monitoring their experiments. The great alchemist Ramon Lull wrote about the exhaustion and financial strain caused by the need to maintain constant fires. He described how practitioners would work for days without sleep tending their furnaces, how they would spend their last coins on fuel, and how the constant heat would slowly destroy their health. The lack of efficient heating systems meant that much of the fuel was wasted, producing more smoke and toxic fumes than useful heat. This inefficiency not only increased costs but also created additional health hazards for practitioners who were forced to work in smoke-filled environments. The storage and handling of fuel also created fire hazards in already dangerous laboratories. The presence of large quantities of combustible materials near open flames and volatile chemicals made fires almost inevitable. The great alchemist Zosimos wrote about the fire hazards created by fuel storage. He described how laboratories would often burn down from careless handling of combustible materials, how entire city blocks could be destroyed by fires that started in alchemical workshops, and how the combination of heat, chemicals and fuel created a perfect storm of danger. The tools and instruments used in alchemical work were primitive, and often ineffective. Practitioners had no way to accurately measure temperature, pressure, or the composition of their materials, relying instead on visual cues and intuition that were often unreliable. The lack of precision instruments meant that alchemists could not reproduce their experiments or verify their results. They worked largely by trial and error, making small adjustments to their procedures based on incomplete information and uncertain outcomes. The great alchemist Cornelius Agrippa wrote about the frustration caused by the lack of reliable instruments. He described how practitioners would struggle to reproduce successful experiments, how they would make countless adjustments to their procedures, and how the lack of precision would lead to endless failures. The crude nature of alchemical equipment also made it difficult to control chemical reactions. Practitioners had no way to regulate temperature or pressure precisely, and they could not predict how their materials would behave under different conditions. The result was that even skilled alchemists would often find themselves dealing with unexpected reactions that could produce toxic gases, explosive mixtures, or other dangerous situations. The lack of control over their experiments made alchemical work extremely hazardous. The great alchemist Albertus Magnus wrote about the unpredictability of alchemical reactions. He described how carefully planned experiments would often go wrong, how minor changes in conditions could produce dramatically different results, and how practitioners would often be surprised by the violence of their chemical reactions. The documentation of alchemical procedures was often incomplete or deliberately obscured, making it difficult for practitioners to learn from each other's experiences or to build upon previous work. Many alchemical texts were written in symbolic language that was designed to hide the true nature of the work from unauthorized readers. These cryptic writings were filled with metaphors and allegories that were nearly impossible to understand without extensive study. The great alchemist Raymond Lully wrote his works in such obscure language that even other alchemists had difficulty understanding his methods. This deliberate obfuscation was intended to protect the secrets of the art, but it also made it nearly impossible for practitioners to learn from each other. The lack of clear documentation meant that each alchemist had to rediscover the basic principles of his work through his own experimentation. This inefficient approach led to countless repetitions of the same dangerous mistakes and, quote, prevented the development of safer working methods. The great alchemist Nicholas Flamel wrote about the difficulties caused by obscure texts. He described how practitioners would spend years trying to understand cryptic instructions, how they would make dangerous mistakes due to misinterpretation, and how the lack of clear guidance would lead to countless accidents. The isolation that characterized alchemical work meant that practitioners had no one to turn to for help when they encountered problems. They were forced to solve every difficulty on their own without the benefit of advice or assistance from more experienced colleagues. This isolation was particularly dangerous when dealing with unfamiliar chemicals or procedures. Practitioners might unknowingly create hazardous situations that could have been avoided with proper guidance. The great alchemist Agrippa wrote about the dangers of working in isolation. He described how practitioners would often make fatal mistakes that could have been prevented with proper instruction, how they would struggle with problems that had already been solved by others, and how the lack of communication would lead to unnecessary deaths. The competitive nature of alchemical work also contributed to the isolation experienced by practitioners. Since they were all seeking the same goals, they often viewed each other as competitors rather than colleagues. This competitive atmosphere prevented the sharing of knowledge and safety information that could have made alchemical work less dangerous. Practitioners would often guard their secrets jealously, even when sharing them might prevent accidents or save lives. The great alchemist Paracelsus wrote about the destructive effects of competition among alchemists. He described how practitioners would sabotage each other's work, how they would spread false information, and how the lack of cooperation would prevent the development of safer working methods. The persecution that alchemists faced from religious authorities was relentless and often deadly. The Catholic Church viewed their work as heretical and dangerous, and the Inquisition was authorized to use any means necessary to suppress it. The methods used by the Inquisition to extract confessions from suspected alchemists were brutal, and often fatal torture was routinely employed to force practitioners to reveal their methods and to confess to crimes they had never committed. The great alchemist Giordano Bruno was burned at the stake in 1600 for his alchemical and philosophical beliefs. His execution was intended to serve as a warning to other practitioners that the Church would not tolerate their work. The fear of persecution forced many alchemists to work in secret, often under assumed names and in hidden locations. This secrecy made their work even more dangerous, as they could not seek help when things went wrong. The great alchemist John Dee was forced to flee England when his alchemical work attracted the attention of religious authorities. He spent years in exile, living in poverty and fear, never able to return to his homeland. The confiscation of alchemical equipment and materials by religious authorities was another form of persecution that could destroy a practitioner's livelihood. Entire laboratories could be seized and destroyed, leaving the alchemist with nothing. The great alchemist Cornelius Agrippa saw his library and laboratory confiscated by the Inquisition. The loss of his books and equipment effectively ended his career and left him destitute. The social stigma attached to alchemy meant that practitioners were often abandoned by their friends and family members who feared guilt by association. This isolation made the already difficult life of an alchemist even more unbearable. The great alchemist Ramon Llull wrote about the loneliness and abandonment that characterized the lives of alchemists. He described how practitioners would gradually lose all human contact, how they would be shunned by society, and how they fall would often end their lives as hermits. The economic consequences of persecution were often as devastating as the physical dangers. Alchemists who were forced to flee their homes would lose everything they had worked for and would be forced to start over in foreign lands. The great alchemist Nicolas Flamel was forced to flee Paris when his alchemical work attracted unwanted attention. He lost his house, his laboratory, and most of his possessions, and was forced to live in exile for many years. The psychological trauma caused by persecution was severe and long-lasting. Many alchemists suffered from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, developing symptoms of anxiety, depression, and paranoia that would affect them for the rest of their lives. The constant fear of arrest and execution created an atmosphere of terror that pervaded every aspect of an alchemist's life. Practitioners could never relax or feel safe, knowing that they might be denounced at any moment. The great alchemist Agrippa wrote about the psychological torture of living under constant threat. He described how practitioners would develop nervous disorders, how they would become paranoid and suspicious, and how the fear of persecution would slowly drive them mad. The informants and spies who infiltrated alchemical circles added another layer of danger to an already perilous profession. Practitioners could never be sure who they could trust, and any casual conversation might lead to denunciation and arrest. The great alchemist Paracelsus wrote about the climate of suspicion that pervaded alchemical communities. He described how practitioners would spy on each other, how they would report suspicious activities to the authorities, and how the fear of informants would destroy trust and cooperation. The physical torture used by the Inquisition to extract confessions from alchemists was designed to be as painful and humiliating as possible. Practitioners might be subjected to the rack, the strappado, or other instruments of torture until they confessed to crimes they had never committed. The great alchemist Diego de Mendoza was tortured for months by the Spanish Inquisition before finally being executed. His treatment was intended to serve as an example to other practitioners of what would happen to those who continued their work. The public executions of alchemists were elaborate spectacles designed to terrorize the population and discourage others from pursuing the forbidden art. These executions were often preceded by auto da fe ceremonies in which the population, condemned, were forced to publicly confess their sins. The great alchemist Giordano Bruno was burned alive in Rome's Campo de' Fiori in front of thousands of spectators. His execution was intended to demonstrate the Church's power and to warn others against following his example. The destruction of alchemical libraries and laboratories was another form of persecution that caused immeasurable damage to the development of scientific knowledge. Entire collections of rare books and manuscripts were burned along with valuable equipment and materials. The Great Library of Alexandria had contained thousands of alchemical texts that were destroyed by Christian mobs in the 4th century. This destruction represented the loss of centuries of accumulated knowledge and forced later practitioners to rediscover basic principles that had already been established. The exile and dispersion of alchemists prevented the formation of schools or traditions that might have made their work safer and more effective. Practitioners were forced to work in isolation without the benefit of institutional support or continuity. The great alchemist Albertus Magnus established a school of alchemy in Paris, but it was quickly suppressed by religious authorities. The destruction of such institutions prevented the development of safer working methods and the training of Tommy V Altes. New practitioners. The censorship of alchemical texts meant that much of the knowledge accumulated by practitioners was lost, or distorted books were banned, burned, or altered to remove dangerous or heretical content. The great alchemist Zosimos wrote extensively about alchemical procedures, but many of his works were destroyed or altered by later copyists who feared persecution. His original insights were lost, and later practitioners were forced to work from incomplete or corrupted texts. The climate of fear created by persecution meant that many talented individuals were deterred from pursuing alchemical studies. The potential for discovery and advancement was severely limited by the knowledge that such work could lead to imprisonment or death. The great alchemist John Dee was one of the most brilliant minds of his generation, but his alchemical work was constantly hampered by the fear of persecution. He was forced to work in secret and could never fully develop his ideas. The long-term effects of persecution on the development of chemistry and medicine were profound. By suppressing alchemical research, religious authorities delayed the development of scientific knowledge by centuries. The great alchemist Paracelsus made important contributions to medicine and chemistry, but his work was largely ignored during his lifetime due to the controversial nature of his alchemical beliefs. It was only later that his insights were recognized and developed. The legacy of persecution continues to influence our understanding of Renaissance alchemy. Much of the historical record was destroyed or distorted by religious authorities, making it difficult to assess the true contributions of alchemical practitioners. The great alchemist Nicholas Flamel became the subject of legends and myths that obscured his real achievements. His actual work was far less dramatic than the stories that grew up around him, but the truth was hidden by centuries of persecution and secrecy. The equipment used in Renaissance alchemical laboratories was not only primitive but also extremely dangerous to manufacture and maintain. The glass vessels that were essential for distillation and other processes were particularly problematic. Glassmaking in the Renaissance was a skilled craft, but the quality of glass available to alchemists was often poor, and unreliable vessels would shatter without warning from thermal shock or chemical reactions, sending sharp fragments flying in all directions. The great alchemist Albertus Magnus wrote about the constant danger of working with glass equipment. He described how practitioners would be cut by flying fragments, how toxic chemicals would be spilled when vessels broke, and how the servant for constant need to replace broken glass would drain their resources. The manufacturing process for glass vessels was itself dangerous. Glassmakers were exposed to extreme heat, toxic fumes, and the constant risk of burns and cuts. Many glassmakers died young from the effects of their work, and the glass they produced was often flawed and unreliable. The lack of standardization in glass production meant that vessels of apparently similar design might behave very differently under the same conditions. Alchemists could never be sure how their equipment would perform, creating an additional layer of uncertainty and danger. The great alchemist Cornelius Agrippa wrote about the frustration of working with unreliable glass equipment. He described how identical vessels would break under different conditions, how the quality of glass would vary from batch to batch, and how practitioners would often be injured by unexpected failures. The metal equipment used in alchemical work was also problematic. Iron tools would rust and contaminate experiments. Copper vessels would corrode and leak, and lead containers would slowly poison anyone who used them. The smelting and forging processes used to create metal equipment were extremely dangerous. Metalworkers were exposed to toxic fumes, extreme heat, and the constant risk of burns and explosions. The quality of metal work was often poor, and equipment would fail at critical moments. The great alchemist Paracelsus wrote about the problems caused by poor quality metal equipment. He described how contaminated metals would ruin experiments, how corroded vessels would leak dangerous chemicals, and how the lack of reliable metalwork would force practitioners to work with inferior tools. The clay vessels and crucibles used in alchemical work were perhaps the most unreliable of all. Pottery techniques in the Renaissance were primitive, and the firing process was often inadequate, resulting in vessels that would crack or explode under pressure. The creation of ceramic equipment was also dangerous. Potters were exposed to toxic glazes, extreme heat, and the constant risk of burns and cuts. The kiln firing process was unpredictable, and many vessels would crack or break during production. The great alchemist Ramon Lull wrote about the frustration of working with ceramic equipment. He described how crucibles would crack during important experiments, how pottery would absorb chemicals and become contaminated, and how the lack of reliable ceramic work would force practitioners to use inferior containers. The combination of poor quality equipment and dangerous working conditions created a perfect storm of hazards that made alchemical work extremely perilous. Practitioners were forced to work with tools that could fail at any moment while handling substances that could kill them instantly. The great alchemist Zosimos wrote about the constant stress of working with unreliable equipment. He described how practitioners would live in fear of equipment failure, how they would constantly inspect their tools for signs of wear, and how the knowledge that their equipment could fail at any moment would add to their anxiety. The lack of quality control in the production of alchemical equipment meant that practitioners had no way to assess the reliability of their tools. They were forced to learn through trial and error, often at the cost of their health or their lives. The great alchemist Nicholas Flamel wrote about the importance of reliable equipment. He described how successful practitioners would often make their own tools and apparatus, spending years learning the skills necessary to create reliable equipment. The maintenance and repair of alchemical equipment was another source of danger. Practitioners were forced to work with broken or damaged tools that could fail catastrophically. They had no access to skilled craftsmen who could repair their mostres, equipment safe. The great alchemist Agrippa wrote about the challenges of maintaining alchemical equipment. He described how practitioners would attempt their own repairs, often making dangerous mistakes, how they would continue to use damaged equipment because they could not afford replacements, and how equipment failure would often ruin months of work. The storage and organization of alchemical equipment was also problematic. Laboratories were typically small and cramped with tools and materials stored haphazardly throughout the workspace. This disorganization contributed to accidents and made it difficult to work safely. The great alchemist Albertus Magnus wrote about the importance of proper laboratory organization. He described how cluttered workspaces would lead to accidents, how poor storage would result in contamination, and how the lack of organization would make it difficult to respond to emergencies. The cleaning and maintenance of equipment was another source of danger. Practitioners had to clean vessels that had contained toxic substances, often exposing themselves to dangerous chemicals in the process. The great alchemist Paracelsus wrote about the hazards of equipment cleaning. He described how practitioners would be poisoned by residual chemicals, how they would be injured by broken glass, and how the process of cleaning equipment would often be more dangerous than using it. The disposal of broken or contaminated equipment was also problematic. Practitioners had no safe way to dispose of tools that had been exposed to toxic substances. Broken glass and contaminated materials were often simply thrown away, creating hazards for others. The great alchemist Cornelius Agrippa wrote about the environmental hazards created by alchemical work. He described how broken equipment would contaminate soil and water, how toxic materials would be released into the environment, and how the careless disposal of waste would create long-term problems. The seasonal variations in alchemical work added another layer of complexity and danger to an already perilous profession. Winter months brought particular hardships as the cold made laboratory work even more difficult and dangerous. Primitive heating systems required for maintaining furnaces consumed enormous amounts of fuel and created additional fire hazards. During the harsh winter of 1543, Master Heinrich von Salzburg was found frozen to death in his laboratory. His furnace had gone out during the night and the bitter cold had claimed his life before dawn. His apprentice discovered the placement on the body the next morning, noting that the master's final experiment had crystallized into beautiful but deadly formations that would have fascinated him had he lived to see them. The lack of proper insulation in Renaissance buildings meant that alchemical laboratories were often unbearably cold in winter. Practitioners would huddle close to their furnaces for warmth, often getting too close to the dangerous flames or breathing concentrated toxic fumes that accumulated in the heated air around the fire. Summer brought different but equally dangerous challenges. The extreme heat made laboratory work almost unbearable, as practitioners were forced to tend furnaces that raised the temperature in their workshops to dangerous levels. The combination of external heat and internal fires created conditions that could lead to heat, stroke, dehydration, and death. The great alchemist Marsilio Ficino wrote about the seasonal challenges faced by practitioners. He described how winter would freeze delicate equipment and ruin experiments, how summer heat would cause chemicals to behave unpredictably, and pulse, how the changing seasons would force alchemists to constantly adapt their methods. The humidity and moisture that came with certain seasons could ruin months of work, as chemicals would absorb water from the air and change their properties. Delicate crystallization processes would be disrupted by unexpected humidity, and carefully prepared materials would spoil if not properly protected. Spring flooding was a particular hazard for alchemists whose laboratories were often located in basements or other low-lying areas. The rising waters would contaminate equipment, destroy materials, and force practitioners to abandon their workspaces, sometimes permanently. Master Giovanni Pico della Mirandola lost his entire laboratory to flooding in 1489 when the Arno River overflowed its banks in Florence. 20 years of accumulated materials and equipment were swept away in a single night, leaving him destitute and unable to continue his work. The seasonal availability of certain raw materials also created problems for alchemists who depended on specific plants, minerals, or other substances that could only be obtained at certain times of year. The inability to maintain consistent supplies meant that experiments would often be interrupted or abandoned. The great alchemist Agrippa wrote about the frustration of seasonal shortages. He described how practitioners would hoard materials during times of abundance, how they would be forced to modify their experiments based on what was available, and how the irregular supply of materials would make it difficult to achieve consistent results. The transportation of materials and equipment was another major challenge for Renaissance alchemists. The poor roads and primitive transportation systems made it dangerous and expensive to move heavy or fragile items. The risk of bandits added another layer of danger to an already hazardous profession. Many alchemists were forced to travel great distances to obtain the materials they needed for their work. These journeys were fraught with danger, as practitioners would often carry valuable substances that made them targets for thieves and robbers. Master Philippus Aureolus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, known as Paracelsus, spent much of his life traveling from city to city seeking new materials and knowledge. His constant movement was partly due to persecution but also reflected the necessity of traveling to obtain the substances needed for his work. The communication between alchemists was severely limited by the poor transportation and communication systems of the time. Letters would take weeks or months to reach their destinations, and important information about new discoveries or dangerous procedures would often arrive too late to be useful. The great alchemist Nicholas Flamel wrote about the isolation caused by poor communications. He described how practitioners would work for years without knowing about advances made by others, how they would repeat dangerous mistakes that had Comtimbiolta fortis mice already been solved, and how the lack of communication would prevent the sharing of important safety information. The preservation of written records was another major challenge for alchemists. The materials available for writing and book production were expensive and fragile. Many important works were lost to fire, flood, or simple decay over time. The deliberate destruction of alchemical texts by religious authorities meant that much knowledge was permanently lost, entire libraries would be burned, and practitioners would be forced to work from memory or incomplete copies of important works. The great alchemist Zosimos wrote about the importance of preserving knowledge. He described how practitioners would hide their most important texts, how they would create multiple copies of crucial information, and how the loss of key manuscripts would set back the progress of the entire field. The copying and translation of alchemical texts was itself a dangerous activity. Scribes who worked on alchemical manuscripts could be accused of heresy or witchcraft, and translators who made alchemical knowledge available in vernacular languages were often persecuted by authorities. The corruption of texts during copying was another problem that plagued alchemical work. Scribes would often misunderstand technical terms or make errors in copying complex diagrams and formulas. These errors would then be perpetuated in subsequent copies, leading to confusion and dangerous mistakes. The great alchemist Albertus Magnus wrote about the problems caused by corrupted texts. He described how errors in copying would lead to dangerous procedures, how misunderstood formulas would cause accidents, and how the accumulation of errors over time would make ancient texts increasingly unreliable. The language barriers that existed in Renaissance Europe created additional challenges for alchemists. Important works were written in Latin, Greek, Arabic, and various vernacular languages, and practitioners often had to work with texts they could not fully understand. The translation of alchemical texts from Arabic to Latin was particularly problematic, as many technical terms had no direct equivalent in Latin. Translators would often create new terms or use approximations that could lead to confusion and quite dangerous mistakes. The great alchemist Jabir ibn Hayyan wrote many important works in Arabic, but the Latin translations that circulated in Europe were often incomplete or inaccurate. European alchemists who relied on these translations would often misunderstand crucial procedures, leading to accidents and failures. The secrecy that surrounded alchemical work meant that practitioners would often deliberately obscure their writing using codes, symbols, and metaphors that made their texts nearly impossible to understand. This deliberate obfuscation was intended to protect the secrets of the art, but it also made it extremely dangerous for students to learn from written sources. The great alchemist Raymond Lully wrote his works in such cryptic language that even experienced alchemists had difficulty understanding his methods. He used elaborate allegories and symbolic descriptions that could be interpreted in multiple ways, leading to confusion and dangerous experiments. The lack of standardized terminology meant that the same substance might be known by dozens of different names in different texts. Mercury alone was known by over 50 different names in various alchemical works, making it extremely difficult for practitioners to understand what materials they were supposed to use. The great alchemist Paracelsus wrote about the confusion caused by inconsistent terminology. He described how practitioners would use the wrong materials due to unclear descriptions, how they would misinterpret procedures because of unfamiliar names, and how the lack of standard terminology would lead to dangerous mistakes. The philosophical and religious aspects of alchemy created additional complications for practitioners who had to navigate complex theological and philosophical questions while trying to conduct practical experiments. The mixing of spiritual and material concerns often led to confusion and dangerous practices. Many alchemists believed that their spiritual state would affect the outcome of their experiments. This belief led to practices such as fasting, prayer, and meditation that could weaken practitioners and make them more vulnerable to the physical dangers of their work. The great alchemist John Dee spent as much time on spiritual practices as he did on actual experiments. He believed that communication with angels and spirits was essential for successful alchemical work. This focus on spiritual matters often distracted him from the practical safety concerns of his laboratory work. The astrological beliefs that were common among alchemists added another layer of complexity to their work. Many practitioners believed that the positions of the planets and stars would affect their experiments, leading them to work at specific times that might not be safe or practical. The great alchemist Cornelius Agrippa wrote extensive treatises on the astrological aspects of alchemy. He described how practitioners would time their experiments according to celestial events, how they would modify their procedures based on planetary positions, and how the belief in astrological influences would complicate their work. The search for the philosopher's stone consumed the lives of countless alchemists who believed that this legendary substance would grant them the ability to transmute base metals into gold and achieve immortality. The pursuit of this impossible goal led many practitioners to take increasingly dangerous risks. The philosopher's stone was believed to be a red powder or crystalline substance that could transform any metal into gold. When properly applied, alchemists would spend decades trying to create this substance using increasingly complex and dangerous procedures. Master Jean de Roquetaillade spent 40 years attempting to create the philosopher's stone. He tried countless combinations of materials and procedures, exposing himself to dangerous chemicals and extreme temperatures. His laboratory was filled with the evidence of his failures, broken equipment stained with the residue of countless experiments. The belief in the philosopher's stone was so strong that many alchemists would sacrifice everything in pursuit of it. Families would be impoverished, laboratories would be destroyed, and practitioners would die from exposure to toxic substances, all in the hope of achieving the impossible. The great alchemist Nicolas Flamel claimed to have successfully created the philosopher's stone, but modern historians believe that his wealth came from more mundane sources such as real estate and money, lending the legend of his priced success inspired countless imitators who wasted their lives trying to duplicate his supposed achievement. The elixir of life was another impossible goal that consumed the lives of alchemists who believed that this legendary potion would grant them immortality and eternal youth. The search for this substance led practitioners to experiment with increasingly dangerous combinations of chemicals and procedures. The elixir was believed to be a liquid that could cure all diseases and extend life indefinitely. Alchemists would consume various concoctions in the hope of achieving immortality, often poisoning themselves in the process. The great alchemist Paracelsus claimed to possess the secret of the elixir of life, but he died at the age of 47, probably from the effects of his own experiments. His death was a stark reminder of the futility of seeking body immortality through chemical means. The search for artificial life was another dangerous obsession that consumed many alchemists who believed that they could create living beings through chemical processes. The pursuit of this goal led to some of the most dangerous and disturbing experiments in alchemical history. The creation of homunculi, or artificial human beings, was a particular focus of many alchemists who believed that they could create life by combining various materials in specific ways. These experiments often involved the use of human body parts and other disturbing materials. The great alchemist Paracelsus wrote detailed instructions for creating homunculi, describing how practitioners should combine human semen with various chemicals and incubate the mixture in horse manure. These grotesque procedures reflected the dark side of alchemical practice. The belief in spontaneous generation led many alchemists to attempt to create living creatures from non-living materials. They would mix various substances in sealed containers, hoping to generate mice, insects, or other creatures through mice brace chemical processes. These experiments often resulted in the creation of dangerous bacterial cultures or toxic compounds that could cause serious illness or death. Practitioners would often become infected with dangerous diseases while attempting to create artificial life. The great alchemist Jan Baptist van Helmont conducted experiments with spontaneous generation that resulted in the creation of toxic molds and bacteria. He nearly died from inhaling the fumes from one of his experiments and spent months recovering from the effects of exposure to dangerous microorganisms. The practice of alchemy was often associated with necromancy and other forms of magic that involved communication with the dead or supernatural beings. These practices added another layer of danger to an already perilous profession. Many alchemists believed that they could summon spirits or demons to help them with their work. These practices often involved the use of dangerous substances such as mercury and sulfur in elaborate rituals that could result in poisoning or other harm. The great alchemist Cornelius Agrippa wrote extensively about the magical aspects of alchemy, describing how practitioners could use their knowledge of chemistry to perform feats that would appear supernatural to observers. These practices often involved the use of dangerous pyrotechnic mixtures that could cause severe burns or explosions. The creation of artificial gems and precious stones was another dangerous pursuit that consumed many alchemists who believed that they could create valuable materials through chemical processes. The pursuit of this goal led to experiments with highly toxic substances and dangerous procedures. The belief that gems possessed magical properties led many alchemists to attempt to create artificial stones that would have the same powers as natural gems. These experiments often involved the use of dangerous chemicals and extreme temperatures. The great alchemist Albertus Magnus wrote about the creation of artificial gems, describing procedures that involved the use of toxic substances such as arsenic and mercury. Practitioners who attempted to follow his instructions often suffered from poisoning or other health problems. The search for universal solvents was another dangerous obsession that consumed many alchemists who believed that they could create substances that would dissolve any material. These experiments often resulted in the creation of highly corrosive acids that could cause severe burns or death. The alkahest or universal solvent was believed to be a liquid that could dissolve any substance without being affected itself. Alchemists would spend years trying to create this impossible substance using increasingly dangerous combinations of acids and other corrosive materials. The great alchemist Paracelsus claimed to have discovered the alkahest, but his descriptions of the substance were so vague that other practitioners were unable to reproduce his work. Many alchemists died from exposure to corrosive substances while attempting to create the universal solvent. The belief in the transmutation of base metals into gold was the driving force behind much of alchemical work, but the procedures used to achieve this goal were often extremely dangerous and rarely successful. Practitioners would expose themselves to toxic substances and extreme temperatures in pursuit of this impossible dream. The process of transmutation was believed to require the use of the philosopher's stone, which had to be created through a series of complex and dangerous procedures. These procedures often involved the use of mercury, lead, and other toxic substances that could cause severe poisoning or death. The great alchemist Ramon Lull wrote detailed descriptions of transmutation procedures that involved heating metals to extreme temperatures and treating them with various chemicals. Practitioners who attempted to follow his instructions often suffered from burns, poisoning, or other injuries. The creation of artificial gold was a particular focus of many alchemists who believed that they could create this precious metal through chemical processes. The pursuit of this goal led to countless experiments with dangerous substances and procedures. Many alchemists would create substances that appeared to be gold, but were actually alloys or other materials that had been treated to change their appearance. These false golds would often contain toxic substances that could cause illness or death. The great alchemist Nicholas Flamel was famous for his supposed ability to create gold, but modern analysis suggests that his wealth came from more conventional sources. His reputation for successful transmutation inspired countless imitators who wasted their lives trying to duplicate his supposed achievements. The social consequences of alchemical work extended far beyond the practitioners themselves. Entire communities could be affected by the presence of alchemists whose work created pollution, health hazards, and other problems for their neighbors. The toxic fumes and waste products from alchemical laboratories would often contaminate the surrounding area, causing illness and death. Among the local population, wells would be poisoned, crops would be damaged, and livestock would sicken and ghost. The Great Fire of London in 1666 was reportedly started by an alchemical experiment that went wrong. The fire spread rapidly through the city, destroying thousands of buildings and killing hundreds of people. This disaster highlighted the dangers that alchemical work posed to entire communities. The presence of alchemists in a community would often lead to increased scrutiny from religious authorities who would investigate the entire area for signs of heresy or witchcraft. This scrutiny could result in persecution and harassment of innocent residents. The economic impact of alchemical work on local communities was often negative, as practitioners would consume scarce resources and contribute little to the local economy. Their work would often drive away other residents and businesses, creating areas of poverty and decline. The great alchemist John Dee was forced to leave several communities because his presence attracted unwanted attention from religious authorities. His neighbors would often petition local officials to expel him, fearing that his work would fall. Fees and tens, 12 fees and tent, bring persecution to the entire area. The environmental damage caused by alchemical work was severe, and long-lasting toxic substances would contaminate soil and water sources, creating health hazards that would persist for generations. The careless disposal of chemical waste would create areas of permanent pollution. The lack of understanding about environmental protection meant that alchemists would often dispose of toxic materials in ways that would contaminate large areas. They would dump waste in rivers, bury it in the ground, or simply abandon it. When they moved to new locations, the great alchemist Paracelsus wrote about the environmental effects of alchemical work, describing how toxic substances would persist in the environment long after the practitioners had moved on. He noted that areas where alchemists had worked would often remain uninhabitable for years. The health effects of alchemical pollution on local populations were severe and often went unrecognized. Children would be born with birth defects, adults would develop mysterious illnesses, and animals would sicken and die from exposure to toxic substances. The lack of medical knowledge about environmental poisoning meant that physicians were often unable to diagnose or treat the health problems caused by alchemical pollution. Symptoms would be attributed to other causes or dismissed as acts of divine punishment. The great alchemist Cornelius Agrippa wrote about the health problems that affected communities near alchemical laboratories. He described how entire neighborhoods would be plagued by mysterious illnesses, how children would be born with deformities, and how the death rate would be significantly higher than in other areas. The legal consequences of alchemical work were severe and often unpredictable. Practitioners could be prosecuted for a wide range of crimes, including fraud, witchcraft, heresy, and endangering public safety. The punishments for these crimes were often brutal and could include imprisonment, torture, and execution. The lack of legal protection for alchemists meant that they were vulnerable to false accusations and arbitrary prosecution. Anyone who bore a grudge against an alchemist could denounce them to the authorities, and there was little recourse for those who were falsely accused. The great alchemist Giordano Bruno was prosecuted by the Inquisition for his alchemical and philosophical beliefs. He was imprisoned for 8 years before being burned at the stake in 1600. His execution was intended to serve as a policing's warning to other practitioners. The confiscation of property was another common punishment for alchemists whose work was deemed illegal or heretical. Entire laboratories would be seized and destroyed, and practitioners would be left with nothing. The great alchemist Cornelius Agrippa saw his library and laboratory confiscated by religious authorities. The loss of his books and equipment effectively ended his career and left him destitute. He spent his final years in poverty and obscurity. The banishment and exile of alchemists was another common punishment that could effectively end their careers. Practitioners would be forced to leave their homes and communities and would often be unable to continue their work in new locations. The great alchemist John Dee was forced into exile after his alchemical work attracted unwanted attention. He spent years wandering from court to court seeking patronage and protection, but was never able to re-establish himself in his patronage homeland. The torture and execution of alchemists was the most severe punishment that could be imposed on practitioners. The methods used were often deliberately brutal and were intended to serve as a warning to others who might consider following their example. The Spanish Inquisition was particularly ruthless in its treatment of alchemists, using torture to extract confessions and burning condemned practitioners at the stake in public ceremonies. These executions were elaborate spectacles designed to terrorize the population and discourage others from pursuing the forbidden art. The great alchemist Diego de Mendoza was tortured for months before being executed by the Spanish Inquisition in 1574. His treatment was documented in detail by the Inquisition records, which provide a chilling account of the methods used to extract confessions from suspected alchemists. The psychological impact of persecution on the alchemical community was profound and lasting. The constant fear of arrest and execution created an atmosphere of terror that affected every aspect of their work. Practitioners would often abandon their research or go into hiding to avoid persecution. The climate of fear created by persecution also affected the quality of alchemical work, as practitioners would often rush their experiments or take dangerous shortcuts to avoid detection. This haste often led to accidents and failures that might have been avoided under normal circumstances. The great alchemist Paracelsus wrote about the psychological effects of persecution, describing how practitioners would develop paranoid behavior, how they would become suspicious of everyone around them, and how the constant fear would become suspicious affect their ability to think clearly and work safely. The destruction of alchemical knowledge through persecution was a tragic loss for human understanding. Entire libraries were burned, important discoveries were lost, and the progress of science was set back by centuries. The burning of the Library of Alexandria in ancient times was one of the most devastating losses of alchemical knowledge, but the persecution of alchemists during the Renaissance resulted in the destruction of countless other works and discoveries. The great alchemist Zosimos wrote about the importance of preserving knowledge, describing how the loss of important texts would force future practitioners to rediscover basic principles that had already been established. He urged his fellow alchemists to hide their most important works and create multiple copies to ensure their survival. The impact of persecution on the development of chemistry and medicine was profound. By suppressing alchemical research, religious authorities delayed the development of scientific knowledge and prevented the discovery of treatments that might have saved countless lives. The great alchemist Paracelsus made important contributions to medicine, but his work was largely ignored during his lifetime due to the controversial nature of his alchemical beliefs. It was only centuries later that his insights were recognized and developed by other researchers. The legacy of persecution continues to affect our understanding of Renaissance alchemy. Much of the historical record was destroyed or distorted by religious authorities, making it difficult to assess the true contributions of alchemical practitioners to the development of modern science. The romantic image of the alchemist as a wise and powerful figure pursuing noble goals is largely a myth created by later generations. The reality was that these men lived lives of grinding poverty, constant danger, and relentless persecution, in pursuit of goals that were often impossible to achieve. The great alchemist Nicholas Flamel became the subject of legends and myths that bore little resemblance to his actual life. The real Flamel was probably a successful businessman who used his wealth to patronize alchemical research rather than a practitioner who had discovered the secrets of transmutation. The modern understanding of chemistry and medicine owes much to the work of Renaissance alchemists, but their contributions came at a terrible cost. The knowledge we now take for granted was purchased with the lives and suffering of buys and countless practitioners who died in pursuit of understanding. The equipment and procedures used by alchemists were primitive and dangerous, but they represented the best available technology of their time. The gradual improvement of these tools and methods over the centuries eventually led to the development of modern laboratory equipment and safety procedures. The great alchemist Robert Boyle is often considered the father of modern chemistry, but his work was built on the foundation laid by countless earlier practitioners who had developed the basic techniques and equipment that made his discovery possible. The transition from alchemy to chemistry was a gradual process that took place over several centuries. The dangerous and often futile pursuits of the alchemists slowly gave way to more systematic and scientific approaches to understanding the natural world. The great alchemist Antoine Lavoisier is often credited with founding modern chemistry, but his work was made possible by the accumulated knowledge and experience of generations of alchemists who had developed the basic techniques of chemical analysis and experimentation. The safety standards and procedures that protect modern chemists and researchers were developed in response to the countless accidents and deaths that occurred in alchemical laboratories. The hard-won knowledge of what substances were dangerous and what procedures were safe was built on the suffering of earlier practitioners. The modern pharmaceutical industry owes much to the work of alchemists who first developed many of the techniques used to create and purify medicinal compounds. The dangerous experiments of practitioners like Paracelsus eventually led to the development of safe and effective medicines. The great alchemist Paracelsus is often called the father of toxicology because of his work on the effects of various substances on the human body. His famous statement that the dose makes the poison became a fundamental principle of modern medicine. The metallurgical techniques developed by alchemists were essential for the development of modern industry. The processes used to extract and purify metals were first developed by practitioners who often died from exposure to toxic substances in their workshops. The great alchemist Georgius Agricola wrote the first comprehensive treatise on metallurgy describing the techniques used to extract metals from ores. His work was based on the accumulated knowledge of generations of alchemists and miners who had developed these dangerous processes. The glass-making techniques developed by alchemists were essential for the development of modern scientific instruments. The complex apparatus used in modern laboratories evolved from the primitive equipment used by Renaissance practitioners. The great alchemist Johann Glauber developed many of the techniques used to create high-quality glass for scientific purposes. His work was based on the accumulated knowledge of generations of alchemists who had experimented with different types of glass and glazes. The distillation techniques developed by alchemists were essential for the development of modern chemical industry. The processes used to separate and purify chemicals were first developed by practitioners who often died from exposure to toxic fumes in their laboratories. The great alchemist Hieronymus Brunschwig wrote one of the first comprehensive treatises on distillation describing the techniques used to extract essences from plants and other materials. His work was based on the accumulated knowledge of pious generations of alchemists who had developed these dangerous processes. As we reach the end of our journey through the dark and dangerous world of Renaissance alchemy, it becomes clear that the lives of these early practitioners were marked by suffering, hardship, and an almost unimaginable level of danger. They worked in conditions that would be considered criminally negligent by modern standards, breathing toxic fumes, handling deadly chemicals, and using equipment that could kill them at any moment. Yet despite these terrible conditions, the alchemists persevered in their work, driven by an insatiable curiosity about the natural world and a burning desire to unlock the secrets of matter itself. They sacrificed their health, their wealth, their families, and often their lives in pursuit of knowledge that would ultimately form the foundation of modern chemistry and medicine. The daily routine of an alchemist was a carefully orchestrated dance with death that began before sunrise and often continued long into the night. Master Johann Hartmann of Marburg would rise at 4 a.m. to tend his furnaces. Before the heat of the day made his laboratory unbearable by 5, he would be grinding minerals with a mortar and pestle, breathing clouds of toxic dust that would slowly accumulate in his lungs over the years. The preparation of materials was itself a dangerous process that required careful attention to detail and an acceptance of constant risk. Mercury had to be purified through repeated distillation, a process that filled the air with deadly braze. Vapors that could cause madness and death. Antimony had to be roasted in special furnaces that produced clouds of toxic smoke, and lead had to be melted and refined in crucibles that could crack and spill molten metal. The great alchemist Basilius Valentinus wrote extensively about the preparation of antimony, describing procedures that involved heating the mineral to extreme temperatures and treating it with various acids. The process he described would have exposed practitioners to deadly fumes and corrosive substances that could cause severe burns or death. The creation of aqua regia, the king of waters, was one of the most dangerous procedures in alchemical work. This powerful acid was created by mixing nitric acid and hydrochloric acid in precise proportions, a process that could produce violent reactions and toxic gases. The acid was so corrosive that it could dissolve gold and would eat through skin and bone in minutes. Master Petrus Bonus of Pola wrote about the creation of aqua regia in his treatise on alchemy, describing how the acid would smoke and bubble when first created, and how practitioners had to be extremely careful not to breathe the fumes or allow the acid to contact their skin. Many alchemists were permanently disfigured by accidents with this substance. The distillation of alcohol was another dangerous procedure that claimed many lives. The process involved heating fermented materials in sealed containers that could explode without warning, sending glass fragments and boiling liquid in all directions. The alcohol vapors that were produced were highly flammable and could ignite with explosive force. The great alchemist Hieronymus Brunschwig wrote the first comprehensive guide to distillation, but his instructions were often unclear, and dangerous practitioners who attempted to follow his procedures would often make fatal mistakes that resulted in explosions or fires that destroyed entire laboratories. The creation of artificial perfumes and cosmetics was a lucrative sideline for many alchemists, but it involved working with substances that were often more dangerous than the materials used in traditional alchemical work. Mercury was commonly used in cosmetics and could cause severe poisoning in both the makers and users. The famous Venetian cosmetic known as ceruse was made from white lead and was extremely popular among wealthy women despite its deadly effects. The alchemists who created this substance were exposed to lead poisoning through repeated handling, and many died from the cumulative effects of their work. Master Giovanni Maranello of Venice became famous for his cosmetic preparations, but he died at the age of 38. From what was almost certainly lead poisoning. his hands were permanently stained black from handling lead compounds, and his hair had fallen out from chronic exposure to toxic substances. The creation of artificial dyes was another dangerous pursuit that consumed many alchemists who sought to create colors that were more vibrant and permanent than natural dyes. The process often involved the use of toxic metals and corrosive acids that could cause severe injuries. The famous purple dye known as imperial purple was created using a complex process that involved mercury and other toxic substances. The alchemists who created this dye were exposed to mercury vapors that could cause neurological damage and almost death. The great alchemist Vannocchio Biringuccio wrote about the creation of artificial dyes in his treatise on metallurgy, describing procedures that involved heating toxic substances to extreme temperatures and treating them with various acids. The processes he described would have exposed practitioners to deadly fumes and corrosive substances. The pharmaceutical preparations created by alchemists were often more dangerous than the diseases they were meant to treat. Mercury was commonly used as a medicine and could cause severe poisoning. Antimony was used as a purgative and could cause violent illness and death. The great alchemist Paracelsus was a pioneer in the use of chemical medicines, but many of his preparations were extremely dangerous. He advocated the use of mercury for treating syphilis, a treatment that often killed the patient before curing the disease. The creation of theriac, a legendary universal antidote, was one of the most complex and dangerous procedures in alchemical work. The preparation involved mixing dozens of ingredients, including viper's flesh and various toxic substances. The process could take months to complete and exposed practitioners to numerous hazards. Master Nicander of Colophon wrote the original recipe for theriac, but his instructions were so complex and dangerous that few alchemists were able to create the substance successfully. Those who attempted the process often suffered from poisoning or other injuries. The preservation of alchemical specimens was another dangerous aspect of the work that required the use of toxic substances and dangerous procedures. Organic materials had to be treated with mercury or other preservatives that could cause severe poisoning. The great alchemist Ulisse Aldrovandi maintained a vast collection of preserved specimens in his laboratory in Bologna, but the preservation process exposed him to dangerous chemicals that gradually destroyed his health. He died from what was probably mercury poisoning after years of exposure. The creation of alchemical automata, or mechanical creatures, was a dangerous pursuit that combined the hazards of metalworking with the risks of alchemical experimentation. These devices were often powered by chemical reactions that could Phi1s and Pzi explode or produce toxic gases. The famous automaton created by Albertus Magnus was said to be so lifelike that it could speak and move on its own. The creation of such devices required the use of dangerous chemicals and complex mechanical systems that could malfunction and cause serious injuries. The great alchemist Giovanni Torriani created several automata for the entertainment of wealthy patrons, but the process of creating these devices was extremely dangerous. He was injured several times by explosions and chemical accidents, and his workshop was destroyed by fire on at least 3 occasions. The study of human anatomy was often combined with alchemical work as practitioners sought to understand the chemical processes that governed life and death. This research involved working with human corpses and bodily fluids that could transmit dangerous diseases. The great alchemist Paracelsus conducted extensive anatomical research. As part of his alchemical work, he would dissect corpses to understand the chemical composition of different organs and tissues. This research exposed him to numerous diseases and infections that gradually weakened his health. The creation of alchemical gardens was another dangerous pursuit that involved growing poisonous plants and experimenting with their chemical properties. These gardens were often located adjacent to laboratories and could contaminate the surrounding area with toxic substances. Master Pietro Andrea Mattioli maintained an extensive alchemical garden in Prague, where he grew numerous poisonous plants for use in his experiments. The garden was so toxic that birds would die from landing on certain plants, and the soil remained contaminated for years after his death. The great alchemist Leonhard Fuchs wrote extensively about the medicinal properties of plants, but his research involved working with extremely dangerous species, including deadly nightshade hemlock and wolfsbane. The preparation of extracts from these plants exposed him to numerous toxins that gradually destroyed his health. The training of new alchemists was complicated by the dangerous nature of the work and the need for secrecy. Most practitioners worked alone or with a single apprentice who would often die from exposure to toxic substances before completing their training. The mortality rate among alchemical apprentices was so high that many masters had difficulty finding students willing to risk their lives for the promise of learning the secrets of the art. Those who did accept the risks often died within the first year of their training. Young Francesco Giorgi became an apprentice to Master Antonio Brassavola in Padua in 1538, promising his parents that he would learn the secrets of creating gold within 3 years. He was dead from mercury poisoning before his first year was complete. His body was found in the laboratory one morning, his skin turned grey, and his hair fallen out in patches. The great alchemist Giovanni Battista Porta wrote about the difficulties of training apprentices, describing how the dangerous nature of the work made it almost impossible to provide adequate instruction. He noted that most apprentices would either die from exposure to toxic substances or flee in terror after witnessing the hazards of alchemical work. The relationship between masters and apprentices was often strained by the dangers of the work and the high mortality rate among students. Masters would often become callous and indifferent to the suffering of their apprentices, seeing them as expendable resources rather than human beings. The legal agreements that bound apprentices to their masters often contained clauses that absolved the master of responsibility for injuries or death that occurred during training. These agreements reflected the accepted understanding that alchemical work was inherently dangerous and that casualties were inevitable. The great alchemist Vannocchio Biringuccio wrote about the legal aspects of alchemical apprenticeships, describing how contracts would typically include provisions for the care of apprentices who were injured or sickened by their work. He noted that these provisions were often inadequate and that many apprentices died without receiving proper medical attention. The medical treatment available to alchemists who were injured or poisoned by their work was primitive and often ineffective. Physicians had little understanding of chemical poisoning and would often prescribe treatments that made the patient's condition worse. The great alchemist Paracelsus was one of the first physicians to understand the effects of chemical poisoning, but his treatments were often as dangerous as the conditions he was trying to cure. He advocated the use of mercury and other toxic substances as medicines, often causing more harm than good. The creation of alchemical instruments and apparatus was itself a dangerous process that required working with molten metals, toxic chemicals, and extreme temperatures. The glassblowers who created the vessels used in alchemical work were exposed to dangerous fumes and extreme heat that could cause severe injuries. Master Antonio Neri wrote extensively about the creation of alchemical glassware, describing procedures that involved working with molten glass at temperatures that could cause severe burns. The process also involved the use of toxic chemicals that could cause poisoning or other health problems. The great alchemist Johann Kunkel became famous for his glass-making techniques, but his work exposed him to dangerous chemicals and extreme temperatures that gradually destroyed his health. He lost several fingers to burns and suffered from chronic lung problems caused by inhaling toxic fumes. The transportation of alchemical materials and equipment was another source of danger that claimed many lives. The primitive roads and transportation systems of the Renaissance made it hazardous to move heavy or fragile items, and the risk of accidents was constant. Many alchemists were killed or injured while attempting to transport their equipment and materials from one location to another. Accidents involving overturned carts, broken equipment, and spilled chemicals were common and often resulted in serious injuries or death. Master Georgius Agricola wrote about the hazards of transporting alchemical materials, describing how accidents during transportation could result in the loss of months or years of work. He noted that many practitioners were ruined by a single accident that destroyed their equipment or materials. The storage of alchemical materials was another constant source of danger that required careful attention to prevent accidents and explosions. Many substances were incompatible with each other and would react violently if they came into present contact. The great alchemist Lazarus Urker wrote extensively about the proper storage of alchemical materials, describing how different substances required different storage conditions and how improper storage could result in dangerous reactions. He noted that many laboratory accidents were caused by the careless storage of incompatible materials. The disposal of alchemical waste was a problem that was poorly understood and often handled in ways that created long-term environmental hazards. Toxic substances would be dumped in rivers, buried in the ground, or simply abandoned when practitioners moved to new locations. The great alchemist Georgius Agricola wrote about the environmental effects of alchemical work, describing how the improper disposal of waste could contaminate soil and water for miles around. He noted that entire regions had been rendered uninhabitable by the careless disposal of alchemical waste. The seasonal variations in alchemical work created additional hazards, as practitioners had to adapt their procedures to changing weather conditions. Winter work was particularly dangerous, as the cold made it difficult to control chemical reactions, and the need for additional heating increased the risk of fires. The great alchemist Vannocchio Biringuccio wrote about the seasonal challenges faced by alchemists, describing how winter conditions would make it difficult to maintain proper temperatures and how summer heat would cause chemicals to behave unpredictably. He noted that many accidents occurred when practitioners failed to account for seasonal variations. The social isolation experienced by alchemists was made worse by the dangerous nature of their work, which made it difficult to maintain normal relationships with family and friends. The constant exposure to toxic substances would often cause practitioners to develop strange behaviors and health problems that made them difficult to be around. The wives and children of alchemists often suffered from the effects of living in close proximity to dangerous chemicals and toxic fumes. Many developed health problems that were directly related to their exposure to alchemical materials. Madonna Caterina, wife of the alchemist master Lorenzo da Carpi, developed a mysterious wasting disease that physicians could not diagnose or treat. Modern medical knowledge would immediately recognize her symptoms as mercury poisoning, but at the time her condition was attributed to divine punishment. The great alchemist Cornelius Agrippa wrote about the effects of alchemical work on family relationships, describing how the dangerous nature of the work would often drive wedges between practitioners and their loved ones. He noted that many alchemists ended their lives alone and abandoned by their families. The financial costs of alchemical work were enormous and often led to bankruptcy and destitution. The expense of equipment, materials, and laboratory space was staggering, and most practitioners struggled to make ends meet. The great alchemist Johann Joachim Becher spent his entire fortune on alchemical experiments and died in poverty. Despite his reputation as a skilled practitioner, he was never able to recover the costs of his research, and his family was left destitute after his death. The competition between alchemists was fierce and often led to sabotage and violence. Practitioners would sometimes poison each other's experiments or steal materials and equipment. The quest for patronage and funding created an emphasis in violence, atmosphere of mistrust and hostility. The great alchemist Edward Kelly was accused of murdering a rival alchemist in Prague in 1591. The charges were never proven, but the incident highlighted the violent competition that existed between practitioners who were seeking the same goals. The legal troubles that plagued many alchemists were often related to their failure to deliver on promises made to wealthy patrons. Investors who had been promised gold or other valuable products would often resort to legal action when their expectations were not met. The great alchemist John Dee spent years in legal disputes with former patrons who claimed that he had defrauded them. These legal troubles consumed much of his time and energy and prevented him from pursuing his research. The religious persecution of alchemists was often motivated by economic factors as much as theological concerns. The church and secular authorities were concerned about the economic disruption that could result from the successful creation of artificial gold. The great alchemist Nicolas Flamel was investigated by French authorities who were concerned about the economic implications of his supposed ability to create gold. The investigation concluded that his wealth came from conventional sources, but the suspicion followed him for the rest of his life. The international nature of alchemical work meant that practitioners often had to deal with the complexities of different legal systems and cultural practices. What was legal in one country might be punishable by death in another. The great alchemist Paracelsus spent much of his life traveling from country to country seeking places where his work would be tolerated. He was repeatedly expelled from cities and kingdoms where his presence was seen as a threat to civ. Established order. The language barriers that existed in Renaissance Europe created additional challenges for alchemists who often had to work with texts and colleagues who spoke different languages. The translation of technical terms was often problematic and could lead to dangerous misunderstandings. The great alchemist Jabir ibn Hayyan wrote many important works in Arabic, but the Latin translations that circulated in Europe were often incomplete or inaccurate. European alchemists who relied on these translations would often misunderstand crucial procedures, leading to accidents and failures. The preservation of alchemical knowledge was complicated by the fragile nature of the materials used for writing and the constant threat of destruction by fire, flood, or human enemies. Many important works were lost forever when libraries were destroyed or practitioners were forced to flee. The great alchemist Zosimos of Panopolis wrote extensively about alchemical procedures, but many of his works were lost when the Library of Alexandria was destroyed. The surviving fragments provide only a glimpse of his knowledge, and many of his discoveries were probably lost forever. The networking and communication between alchemists was severely limited by the poor transportation and communication systems of the time. Important discoveries might take months or years to reach other practitioners, and safety information was often not shared at all. The great alchemist Robert Fludd maintained an extensive correspondence with other practitioners across Europe, but his letters often took weeks or months to reach their destinations, and important information about new discoveries or dangerous procedures would often arrive too late to be useful. The standardization of alchemical procedures was almost impossible due to the secretive nature of the work and the lack of reliable communication between practitioners. Each alchemist would develop his own methods and terminology, making it difficult to share knowledge or verify results. The great alchemist Paracelsus wrote extensively about the need for standardization in alchemical work, but his own writings were often deliberately obscure and difficult to understand. He recognized the problem, but was unable to solve it. Within the constraints of his time, the quality control of alchemical materials was non-existent, and practitioners often had to work with substances of unknown purity or composition. This uncertainty added another layer of danger to already hazardous procedures. The great alchemist Georgius Agricola wrote about the problems caused by impure materials, describing how contaminated chemicals would produce unexpected reactions and how the lack of quality control would make it difficult to achieve consistent results. The documentation of alchemical procedures was often incomplete or deliberately obscured, making it difficult for practitioners to learn from each other's experiences or to build upon previous work. The tradition of secrecy that surrounded the art prevented the development of a systematic approach to chemical research. The great alchemist Raymond Lully wrote his works in such cryptic language that even other alchemists had difficulty understanding his methods. This deliberate obfuscation was intended to protect the secrets of the art, but it also made it alchemists had difficulty understanding his methods. Nearly impossible for practitioners to learn from each other. The training institutions that existed for other professions were largely absent in alchemy due to the dangerous nature of the work and the need for secrecy. Most practitioners learned through trial and error, often at the cost of their health or their lives. The great alchemist Paracelsus attempted to establish a school of chemical medicine, but his efforts were opposed by both medical authorities and religious leaders who saw his work as dangerous and heretical. The failure of such institutional efforts meant that knowledge was not systematically preserved or transmitted. The professional organizations that might have provided support and protection for alchemists were prevented from forming by the illegal or semi-legal status of the work. Practitioners were forced to work in isolation without the benefits of collective action or mutual aid. The great alchemist Cornelius Agrippa wrote about the need for professional organizations among alchemists, but noted that the secretive nature of the work and the constant threat of persecution made such organizations impossible to establish. The economic exploitation of alchemists by wealthy patrons was a constant source of hardship and danger. Investors would often demand impossible results in unrealistic timeframes, forcing practitioners to take dangerous shortcuts or make false promises. The great alchemist Edward Kelly was pressured by his patron Emperor Rudolph II to produce gold within a specific time frame. The pressure to deliver results led Kelly to attempt increasingly dangerous experiments that ultimately resulted in his death. The marketing and sale of alchemical products was often fraudulent, and dangerous practitioners would often sell substances that were contaminated with toxic materials or that had been prepared using dangerous procedures. The buyers of these professed products were often unaware of the risks they were taking. The great alchemist Leonhard Thurnisser became wealthy by selling alchemical preparations to wealthy clients. But many of his products were contaminated with mercury and other toxic substances that caused serious health problems for his customers. The regulation of alchemical practice was inconsistent and often ineffective. Authorities would sometimes attempt to control the work through licensing or taxation, but these efforts were usually undermined by the secretive nature of the alchemical practice. Profession. The great alchemist John Dee obtained a license to practice alchemy from Queen Elizabeth I, but this official sanction did not protect him from persecution by religious authorities who continued to view his work as dangerous and heretical. The insurance and financial protection that might have helped alchemists deal with the risks of their work was virtually non-existent. Practitioners who were injured or whose laboratories were destroyed had little recourse and often faced financial ruin. The great alchemist Vannocchio Biringuccio wrote about the financial risks of alchemical work, describing how a single accident could destroy years of work and investment. He noted that many practitioners were ruined by events beyond their control. The legacy of Renaissance alchemy is complex and multifaceted. While the work of these early practitioners laid the foundation for modern chemistry and medicine, their methods were often dangerous and their goals were frequently impossible to achieve. The great alchemist Paracelsus perhaps summed up the tragic nobility of their quest when he wrote that the alchemist must be willing to sacrifice everything in service of the great work, even if that sacrifice included his own life and sanity. Their laboratories may have been death traps, their methods may have been primitive, and their theories may have been flawed, But the Renaissance alchemists were true pioneers of science who laid the groundwork for our modern understanding of chemistry, physics, and medicine. The transition from alchemy to modern chemistry was a gradual process that took centuries to complete. The dangerous and often futile pursuits of the alchemists slowly gave way to more systematic and scientific approaches to understanding the natural world. The great alchemist Robert Boyle is often considered the father of modern chemistry, but his work was built on the foundation laid by countless earlier practitioners who had developed the basic techniques and equipment that made his discovery possible. The safety standards and procedures that protect modern chemists and researchers were developed in response to the countless accidents and deaths that occurred in alchemical laboratories. The hard-won knowledge of what substances were dangerous and what procedures were safe was built on the suffering of earlier practitioners. The next time you take a medication, visit a doctor, or marvel at a scientific discovery, remember the countless alchemists who died in smoky, toxic laboratories so that we might have the knowledge we enjoy today. Their lives were indeed terrible, but their sacrifice was not in vain. So, as we close this chapter on the disturbing lives of Renaissance alchemists, let us take a moment to honor their memory and reflect on the price of progress. These men paid the ultimate price for human knowledge, and their suffering helped to light the way for all who came after them. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the shadows of scientific history, and remember, if you enjoyed this exploration of the past, please consider subscribing for more tales of historical hardship and human perseverance. Until next time, may your dreams be filled with the gentle glow of knowledge safely acquired, rather than the toxic fumes of a Renaissance laboratory. Sweet dreams, and may you never forget the price that was paid for the wisdom we now take for granted.